The sound of forced laughter echoed through the dining room, as my brother-in-law Richard raised his wineglass for what felt like the 100th toast of the evening. Christmas lights twinkled mockingly from the mantelpiece while I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my untouched plate of turkey growing cold as I watched him bask in the admiration of our extended family. His latest achievement, apparently, was closing the biggest real estate deal in the county's history, a luxury resort development that would bring millions to the local economy and cement his reputation as the golden boy of the Morrison family dynasty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of them knew, what Richard had made sure they would never know, was that every blueprint, every environmental impact study, every zoning proposal that made his precious resort possible had come from my architectural firm. 3 years of my life, countless sleepless nights, and innovative sustainable design solutions that had revolutionized how luxury developments could coexist with environmental preservation. Yet here he sat, 38 years old and insufferably smug, accepting praise for vision and creativity that belonged entirely to me. I'm Sarah Chen, and at 45, I should have been celebrating the pinnacle of my architectural career instead of watching my life's work being credited to someone else across a Christmas dinner table. My sustainable architecture firm, GreenSpace Designs, had been struggling financially when Richard approached me 18 months ago with what seemed like a lifeline. His development company, Morrison Holdings, needed an architect for an ambitious resort project on the pristine shores of Lake Tahoe. The catch was that it had to meet the strictest environmental standards while still delivering the luxury experience. That would justify the astronomical investment his backers were demanding. I remember the day he first walked into my cramped office above the coffee shop on Maple Street, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with my second-hand furniture and the architectural models I'd built from recycled cardboard. Richard had always been the successful one in the family, the one who married my sister Emma and gave my parents the grandchildren they'd been not so subtly hinting I should provide. He was charming, confident, and had that particular brand of charisma that made people want to hand him their trust along with their checkbooks. The Emerald Shores Resort project was exactly what I needed to save my firm from bankruptcy. Richard painted a picture of partnership, of shared success, of finally being recognized for the innovative work I'd been doing in sustainable architecture for over 2 decades. He promised me full credit as the lead architect, a partnership in the development company, and a percentage of the profits that would set me up for life. All I had to do was create something extraordinary, something that would prove luxury and environmental responsibility weren't mutually exclusive. For 3 years, I poured everything into that project. I developed new techniques for geothermal heating that reduced energy consumption by 60%. I designed water reclamation, systems that actually improved the lake's ecosystem rather than harming it. I created buildings that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself, using locally sourced materials and construction methods that left virtually no carbon footprint. The resort wasn't just environmentally sustainable, it was regenerative, actually healing the land while providing an unparalleled luxury experience. The breakthrough came when I solved the fundamental challenge that had been plaguing sustainable resort design for decades. How do you create structures that provide 5-star amenities while having a negative environmental impact? My answer was the living building concept, where each structure would generate more energy than it consumed, purify more water than it used, and create more habitat than it displaced. It was revolutionary, and I knew it would change the industry forever. Richard had been present for many of our design meetings, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. I thought he was simply being a thorough client, someone who wanted to understand every aspect of the project he was investing in. I was naive enough to believe that his interest stemmed from respect for my expertise rather than a calculated plan to steal it. The warning signs were there: subtle at first, but growing more obvious as the project neared completion. Richard began scheduling meetings with investors and city planners without including me. When I questioned this, he explained that it was more efficient for him to handle the business side while I focused on the technical aspects. He started referring to himself as the project's visionary in casual conversations, while relegating me to the role of the talented architect who was implementing his ideas. The final betrayal came 6 months ago when Richard presented the Emerald Shores project to the State Environmental Council for their prestigious Green Innovation Award. I watched the live stream from my office, my stomach churning as he described the living building concept as his own brainchild, explaining how his background in business had given him unique insights into balancing environmental responsibility with economic viability. He spoke eloquently about the innovative systems I'd developed, using the exact phrases and technical terminology I'd spent months perfecting, but presenting them as his own discoveries. When he won the award, accepting the crystal trophy and the $50,000 prize, I felt something break inside me. This wasn't just professional disappointment or wounded pride. This was the systematic erasure of everything I'd worked to achieve, the theft of not just my ideas but my identity as an innovator. I tried confronting him privately, calling his office the day after the award ceremony. His assistant, a young woman who seemed genuinely sympathetic, told me that Mr. Morrison was too busy preparing for the project's grand opening to take my call. When I finally reached him 3 days later, his response was devastating in its casual cruelty. "Sarah, you did excellent work on the technical implementation," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd heard him use with his housekeeping staff. "But let's be realistic about what happened here. I identified the market opportunity, secured the funding, managed the regulatory approvals, and guided the creative vision. You translated my ideas into blueprints. That's what architects do. You were compensated fairly for your time and expertise." I reminded him of our partnership agreement, of his promises of shared credit and profit participation. His laugh was cold and dismissive. "Sarah, I think you misunderstood our arrangement. Check your contract. You were hired as a consulting architect, nothing more. And frankly, at your age and with your firm's financial situation, you should be grateful for the opportunity to work on a project of this magnitude." That conversation ended with him hanging up on me while I was mid-sentence, trying to explain that the living building concept had been my innovation, not his interpretation of market demands. For weeks afterward, I'd attempted to contact other team members, hoping someone would corroborate my version of events. But Richard had been methodical in his narrative construction. Every document, every email, every meeting summary positioned him as the creative force behind the project, and me as the skilled technician who had executed his vision. The local press had embraced the story of the visionary young businessman who'd revolutionized sustainable development. Richard's face appeared on magazine covers, and he was invited to speak at conferences across the country. Meanwhile, I watched my architectural firm's reputation stagnate while potential clients hired me for conventional projects, unaware that I was the mind behind the year's most celebrated environmental innovation. Tonight's Christmas dinner was supposed to be a family celebration, a chance to set aside professional disappointments and enjoy the holiday season. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as I listened to my father toast Richard's incredible vision and business acumen, as I watched my sister Emma beam with pride at her husband's success, as I endured my mother's not-so-subtle comments about how I should find a nice man to take care of me instead of struggling with my little architecture hobby, I felt the familiar rage building in my chest. The breaking point came during dessert. My Aunt Helen, who'd had perhaps one too many glasses of wine, looked across the table at me with genuine concern. "Sarah, dear, I hope you're saving something for retirement. It must be difficult competing with all those young architects when clients want fresh ideas and energy." Before I could respond, Richard jumped in with what I'm sure he thought was gallant support. Actually, Sarah's been quite helpful with some of our recent projects. She's excellent at handling the more technical aspects while we focus on the creative vision and client relationships. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, but what made it worse was the approving nods from around the table. Even my sister, who I'd confided in about my struggles, seemed to accept this characterization of my role in Richard's success. In fact, Richard continued, warming to his theme as he always did when he had an audience, Sarah's a perfect example of how experience and fresh thinking can complement each other. She brings valuable technical skills to projects that younger architects conceptualize and develop. My mother chimed in with her usual tact. Well, that's wonderful that you can still find ways to contribute, Sarah. At 45, it's important to be realistic about your limitations. The conversation might have continued in this vein, each family member adding their own thoughts about my diminished prospects and Richard's generous accommodation of my declining relevance. But something in Richard's expression stopped them. He was looking directly at me, and there was something calculating in his gaze, as if he was measuring my reaction and finding it amusing. The truth is, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room, Sarah's reached the point in her career where she's more of a burden than an asset. The industry is moving toward innovative, sustainable design, and frankly, architects from her generation just can't keep up with the pace of change. The word hit me like a physical blow. Burden. After everything I'd created, everything I'd contributed not just to his success but to advancing the entire field of sustainable architecture, he was dismissing me as a burden. The casual cruelty of it, delivered in front of my family with such confident authority, was breathtaking. The table fell silent except for the soft Christmas music playing from my sister's stereo system. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond to this public humiliation. Some faces showed embarrassment, others curiosity. But what struck me most was that no one looked surprised. This characterization of me as an aging professional whose time had passed seemed to align with their existing perceptions. I set down my fork carefully, my hand steadier than I felt. When I spoke, my voice was calm and measured, though I could feel the fury building beneath the surface. That's an interesting perspective, Richard. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on innovative, sustainable design. He seemed pleased by what he interpreted as my acceptance of his assessment. Well, take the Emerald Shores project, for example. The kind of integrated thinking required to balance environmental impact with luxury amenities, that's not something you can just learn from textbooks or past experience. It requires genuine innovation, the ability to see possibilities that others miss. As he spoke, describing my innovations as if they were his own insights, I made a decision that would change both our lives. Richard wanted to paint me as a burden, as dead weight holding back the industry's progress. He was about to learn exactly what kind of burden I could become when I stopped trying to be accommodating and started leveraging every advantage my experience had given me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of strained conversation and forced holiday cheer. I smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, complimented my sister's meal preparation, and even managed to laugh at my uncle's terrible Christmas jokes. But inside, I was methodically planning Richard's downfall with the same precision I'd used to design his precious resort. By the time I said my goodbyes and drove home through the snow-covered streets to my small apartment above the architecture firm, I had formulated the beginning of a strategy that would expose Richard's fraud and reclaim credit for my work. More importantly, I was going to ensure that his definition of burden became a self-fulfilling prophecy, but not in the way he'd intended. The next morning, I arrived at my office before dawn, the Christmas decorations from the coffee shop below, casting festive shadows through my windows. I made coffee in the small kitchenette I'd installed when money was too tight to eat out regularly, and sat down at my drafting table with a legal pad and my laptop. If Richard wanted to play games with intellectual property and professional reputation, He was about to discover that I'd been playing in this arena a lot longer than he had. The first step was documenting everything. Over the past 3 years, I'd been meticulous about keeping records, a habit developed during my early career when clients would try to change specifications without acknowledging the additional work required. Every email, every sketch, every revision was organized chronologically in both digital and physical files. What I hadn't done was protect myself legally from someone stealing credit for my work. As I reviewed the paper trail, a pattern emerged that was both damning and encouraging. Richard had been careful to position himself as the project lead in official documents, but the creative development was clearly documented as my work. My preliminary sketches, my research notes, my correspondence with environmental consultants, all of it painted a clear picture of who had actually developed the innovations he was claiming. The challenge was that Richard controlled the narrative through his development company and his media relationships. He had the platform, the credibility, and the resources to maintain his version of events. What I had was the truth and a deep understanding of how the architecture and development industries actually functioned. I spent the morning creating a comprehensive timeline of the project's development, cross-referencing my documentation with public statements Richard had made about the resort. The inconsistencies were glaring once laid out systematically. He'd claimed credit for innovations that predated his involvement in the project, described technical solutions in language that clearly came from my reports, and even used photographs of my early conceptual models in his presentations to investors. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. Richard's success depended on maintaining relationships with investors, regulatory officials, and industry leaders who valued both innovation and reliability. If I could demonstrate that he was neither innovative nor reliable, his carefully constructed reputation would crumble quickly. The breakthrough came when I remembered something Richard had mentioned during one of our early meetings. He'd been bragging about his ability to navigate regulatory approvals, claiming that his understanding of environmental law gave him advantages over competitors. At the time, I'd been impressed by his knowledge. Now, reviewing our conversations, I realized he'd been repeating information I'd provided him about environmental regulations, presenting my research as his expertise. This gave me an idea that was both elegant and devastating. If Richard was going to claim expertise in sustainable design and environmental law, I was going to put that claimed expertise to the test in a very public way. The State Environmental Council, the same organization that had given him their Green Innovation Award, was hosting their annual conference in 3 weeks. Richard was scheduled as the keynote speaker, expected to share insights from the Emerald Shores project with an audience of environmental professionals, architects, and regulatory officials. I had 3 weeks to prepare a challenge that would expose his fraud while reclaiming credit for my work. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be risk-free. But after last night's humiliation, I was done playing it safe. The first call I made was to my former colleague, Janet Rodriguez, who now worked as an environmental consultant for the state. Janet and I had collaborated on several projects over the years, and she'd always respected my work even when it didn't receive the recognition it deserved. More importantly, she had access to the technical review process that had led to Richard's award. Sarah. Janet's voice carried genuine warmth when she answered. How are you? I saw the coverage of the Emerald Shores project. Congratulations on being part of such an innovative development. The phrase being part of stung, but I kept my voice neutral. Thank you, Janet. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I'm working on a follow-up project and wanted to review some of the technical specifications from Emerald Shores. Would it be possible to access the original submission materials? There was a pause before Janet responded. I can probably arrange that. The award submissions are public record once the review process is complete. Is there something specific you're looking for? I took a calculated risk. I'm particularly interested in the living building concept specifications. I want to make sure I'm building on the most current version of the technical requirements. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah, I have to ask, were you the architect on that project? Because the submission materials are quite detailed about building systems and environmental integration, but they're attributed entirely to Morrison Holdings with no mention of consulting architects. This was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. That's interesting. Could you send me whatever documentation you can access? I'd like to review the technical details. Janet agreed to email me the public submission materials, and I spent the rest of the day planning my next moves. By evening, I had outlined a strategy that would systematically dismantle Richard's reputation while establishing my credentials as the true innovator behind the Emerald Shores project. The plan was ambitious and would require careful timing, but it leveraged every advantage I possessed: my technical expertise, my documentation, and my understanding of how the architecture and environmental communities operated. Richard had made the mistake of thinking that being a burden meant being powerless. He was about to learn the difference between being underestimated and being defeated. As I worked late into the night, surrounded by the evidence of my stolen innovations and the tools I would use to reclaim them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about the future. Richard had called me a burden during Christmas dinner, but before I was finished, he was going to discover that some burdens are too heavy to carry. The email from Janet arrived at 6 a.m, 3 days after our phone conversation. As I scrolled through the PDF attachments containing Richard's award submission, my coffee grew cold in my hands. Every technical innovation, every environmental solution, every breakthrough that I'd developed was presented as the original thinking of Morrison Holdings. But what made my blood boil wasn't just the theft itself, it was the way my work had been simplified and dumbed down to match Richard's limited understanding of sustainable architecture. The living building concept, which I'd spent months perfecting, was described in basic terms that missed the revolutionary aspects of the design. The integrated water systems were explained incorrectly, suggesting that Richard didn't actually understand how they functioned. Most damning of all, the submission included technical drawings that were clearly my work, down to the distinctive notation style I'd developed over 20 years of practice, but with Morrison Holdings listed as the originating firm. I printed every page and spread them across my conference table, cross-referencing each claim with my original documentation. The pattern was unmistakable. Richard had taken my comprehensive technical proposals and repackaged them as his own visionary concepts. But in doing so, he'd made critical errors that any experienced environmental architect would immediately recognize. My phone rang as I was documenting the most egregious discrepancies. The caller ID showed Emma's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. My relationship with my sister had been strained since Richard started claiming credit for my work, partly because she seemed incapable of believing her husband was capable of such calculated deception. "Sarah, I wanted to apologize for last night," Emma said without preamble when I answered. "Richard was out of line calling you a burden. I spoke to him about it this morning." I set down my red pen and leaned back in my chair. "What did he say?" "He feels terrible about it. You know how he gets when he's had too much wine and he's nervous about a big presentation. He's speaking at some environmental conference next week, and he's been stressed about it." The irony was almost laughable. Richard was stressed about presenting my work to an audience of environmental professionals who would immediately recognize his lack of genuine expertise. "Emma, did Richard ever tell you how involved I was in the Emerald Shores project?" There was a pause before she answered. "He said you helped with some of the technical drawings. Sarah, I know you're proud of your work, but Richard conceived that whole project. He spent months developing the environmental concept before he even hired you. The casual dismissal of my contribution, delivered by my own sister with such certainty, hit harder than Richard's public humiliation. Emma had always been the family favorite, the one who made conventional choices that our parents could understand and celebrate. Her marriage to Richard had cemented her position as the successful daughter, while my unconventional career and single status marked me as the family disappointment. Emma, what if I told you that every environmental innovation in that project came from my research? What if I could prove that Richard has been taking credit for work he didn't do and doesn't even understand? Another pause, longer this time. Sarah, I think you're letting your professional disappointment cloud your judgment. Richard's not perfect, but he's not a liar. And frankly, this jealousy isn't attractive. Maybe you should consider that partnership, he mentioned, where you handle the technical side while he manages the creative vision. The conversation ended with Emma suggesting I seek therapy to deal with my issues around success and recognition. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring at the evidence spread across my table, feeling more isolated than I had since starting my firm 2 decades ago. Richard hadn't just stolen my work, he'd systematically poisoned my family relationships. By positioning himself as the generous mentor tolerating my increasingly desperate attempts to claim credit I hadn't earned. But Emma's mention of Richard's upcoming presentation had given me an idea. If he was nervous about speaking to environmental professionals, it was probably because he knew he was out of his depth. This conference wasn't a friendly media interview, or a business networking event where his charm could carry him through surface-level questions. This was the annual gathering of the people who actually understood sustainable design at a technical level. I spent the rest of the morning researching the State Environmental Council's conference agenda. Richard was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on Innovation in Sustainable Development, Lessons from Emerald Shores. The session description promised insights into breakthrough design methodologies and next-generation environmental integration. It was exactly the kind of technical presentation that would expose his lack of genuine expertise. The conference was invitation only, limited to environmental professionals, regulatory officials, and accredited architects specializing in sustainable design. I'd attended several times over the years, back when my firm had been more prominent, in the green building community. Getting an invitation now would require calling in favors and demonstrating current relevance in the field. My first call was to Dr. Michael Harrison, who directed the university's environmental architecture program. I'd guest lectured in his classes several times and served on thesis committees for his graduate students. More importantly, he was on the conference planning committee and had the authority to extend last-minute invitations to qualified professionals. Sarah Chen, I was just thinking about you, Michael said when his assistant put me through. I saw the coverage of the Emerald Shores Resort. Congratulations on being involved in such a groundbreaking project. Again, that phrase. Actually, Michael, that's why I'm calling. I'd love to attend the Environmental Council conference to hear more about how other professionals are responding to the project. Is there any possibility of getting a last-minute invitation? Absolutely. We always have a few spaces reserved for practicing architects who can contribute to the discussions. I'll have my assistant send you the registration materials today. Getting access to the conference was easier than I'd expected, but that was just the first step. What I needed was a way to publicly challenge Richard's presentation without looking like a bitter colleague settling personal scores. The conference had a tradition of technical Q&A sessions following each presentation, where audience members could ask detailed questions about methodologies and implementation strategies. For someone presenting stolen work they didn't fully understand, this could be devastating. I spent the next week preparing questions that would expose the gaps in Richard's knowledge while highlighting the true complexity of the innovations he was claiming. The key was to frame them as legitimate professional inquiries that any expert should be able to answer easily. If Richard couldn't respond adequately, it would raise questions about his actual role in developing the technologies he was credited with creating. But I needed more than just gotcha questions. If I was going to reclaim credit for my work, I needed a platform and allies who could help amplify the truth. The environmental architecture community was relatively small and well-connected. If I could convince a few respected professionals that Richard was a fraud, word would spread quickly through the networks that mattered. My opportunity came from an unexpected source. Janet Rodriguez called me on Thursday afternoon with news that changed everything. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the Emerald Shores submission materials," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "I did some additional research, and there are some irregularities in the documentation that are bothering me." My pulse quickened. What kind of irregularities? The technical specifications reference design methodologies and environmental data that predate Morrison Holdings' involvement in the project. Some of the building system designs reference patents and research that wouldn't have been available to someone just starting to develop these concepts. Janet had discovered what I'd been hoping someone would notice. The paper trail that proved my innovations had been developed independently of Richard's project timeline. What does that mean for the award? Potentially, it means the submission contains misrepresented information about the origin of the innovations. The Environmental Council takes intellectual property very seriously. If there's evidence that the award was based on false claims about who developed these technologies, they would want to investigate. This was exactly the opening I needed. "Janet, would you be willing to review some additional documentation that might clarify the timeline of these innovations?" She agreed to meet me the following day, and I spent Thursday night organizing the most compelling evidence of my authorship. By Friday afternoon, Janet was convinced that Richard had committed fraud in his award submission. More importantly, she was willing to bring her concerns to the attention of the conference organizers. "Sarah, this is serious," she said, as we reviewed my documentation in her office. "If Richard presents this work as his own innovation at next week's conference, he'll be perpetuating the fraud in front of the entire environmental community. But if we can demonstrate the true authorship before his presentation, we can prevent further damage to the profession's integrity." Janet's support gave me something I'd been lacking: credibility within the official environmental community. She had the standing and the platform to raise questions about Richard's claims without appearing personally motivated. Together, we developed a strategy that would expose his fraud while protecting my reputation. The plan was elegantly simple. Janet would attend Richard's presentation and ask specific technical questions about the development process. If he couldn't answer them adequately, she would share her concerns about the award submission with other conference attendees. Meanwhile, I would be present as a concerned architect, ready to provide the correct information about how these innovations had actually been developed. Saturday morning, I drove to the conference venue with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness I hadn't felt since defending my master's thesis 25 years earlier. The Riverside Convention Center was buzzing, with environmental professionals all eager to hear about the latest developments in sustainable design. Richard's presentation was the opening keynote, scheduled to set the tone for the entire 3-day conference. I registered under my professional credentials and received a name tag identifying me as a principal architect with GreenSpace Designs. Several attendees recognized my name from my earlier work in sustainable housing, and I found myself drawn into conversations about current projects and industry trends. For the first time in months, I felt like a respected member of the professional community rather than a burden dragging down more innovative colleagues. Richard arrived 15 minutes before his presentation, surrounded by what appeared to be a small entourage of Morrison Holdings employees and local media representatives. He looked confident and well-prepared, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most architects' monthly rent. When he spotted me in the crowd, his expression shifted from confidence to confusion, then to something that might have been concern. He made his way over to me, his smile carefully constructed. "Sarah, what a surprise to see you here. I didn't know you were still active in the environmental architecture community." The casual insult was delivered with such practiced smoothness that several nearby professionals didn't even seem to notice it. "I try to stay current with developments in sustainable design," I replied evenly. "I'm looking forward to your presentation on the Emerald Shores innovations." Something in my tone must have alerted him to potential danger, because his smile became more forced. Well, I hope you enjoy it. I think you'll find that we've taken the concepts we discussed into some exciting new directions. Before I could respond, a conference organizer approached to escort Richard to the main auditorium. As he walked away, I noticed that his confidence seemed slightly diminished, and he kept glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The auditorium was packed, with several hundred environmental professionals eager to hear about breakthrough innovations in sustainable development. Janet saved me a seat in the third row, close enough to ask questions, but not so prominent as to appear confrontational. As the lights dimmed and Richard took the stage, I felt the familiar surge of anger at seeing him prepared to claim credit for my life's work. His presentation began well enough, with polished slides and confident delivery about the challenges of balancing luxury amenities with environmental responsibility. But as he moved into the technical details of the living building concept, his limitations became apparent to anyone with genuine expertise in sustainable design. He described the integrated water systems using terminology that was close to correct, but missed the nuances that made the innovation revolutionary. When he explained the energy generation technologies, he confused several key concepts and presented the breakthrough aspects as incremental improvements rather than fundamental advances. Most telling, when he showed technical drawings of the building systems, he couldn't answer basic questions about how the components actually functioned together. 20 minutes into the presentation, Janet raised her hand. Mr. Morrison, could you explain how the geothermal loop interfaces with the photovoltaic array to optimize energy storage during peak demand periods? It was a straightforward question that any architect familiar with the system should be able to answer easily. Richard paused, clearly struggling to formulate a response that would demonstrate actual understanding rather than memorized talking points. That's an excellent technical question, he said, buying time. The integration of those systems required extensive collaboration with our consulting team to optimize the performance parameters. Janet pressed further. Could you walk us through the specific design decisions that led to the 15% efficiency improvement over standard geothermal installations? Richard's pause was longer this time, and I could see perspiration beginning to show on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The efficiency improvements came from innovative thinking about how to leverage the thermal mass calculations in combination with the site-specific geological conditions. It was a non-answer that used technical terminology without demonstrating any actual understanding of the engineering involved. Murmurs began rippling through the audience as other professionals recognized that the keynote speaker couldn't explain the details of his own supposed innovations. Dr. Harrison, who was moderating the session, tried to move the presentation forward. Perhaps we could focus on the broader implications of this project for future sustainable development? But the damage was already done. Richard had exposed his lack of technical knowledge in front of the exact audience that could recognize and appreciate the true innovations he was claiming. When he tried to continue with his prepared remarks, his delivery was noticeably less confident, and he seemed to be rushing through technical sections that he clearly didn't want to discuss in detail. During the break following his presentation, small groups of attendees gathered to discuss what they'd witnessed. I overheard several conversations questioning Richard's actual role in developing the technologies he'd presented. The consensus seemed to be that while the innovations were genuinely impressive, the presenter didn't appear to understand them at a level consistent with being their primary developer. Janet approached me as I stood near the refreshment table, trying to process the success of our initial strategy. That went better than I'd hoped, she said quietly. Several people have already asked me about the technical discrepancies in his responses. Before I could reply, Richard himself appeared beside us. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by barely controlled anxiety. Sarah, could I speak with you privately? Janet excused herself, leaving Richard and me alone in a corner of the lobby. When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. What are you doing here? Are you trying to sabotage my presentation? I met his gaze steadily. I'm attending a professional conference to learn about innovations in sustainable design. Although I have to say, I was surprised by some of the technical gaps in your presentation. His face flushed with anger. You know exactly what you're doing. This is about Christmas dinner, isn't it? I apologized to Emma for that comment about you being a burden. Can't you just let it go? The fact that he thought this was about hurt feelings rather than stolen intellectual property revealed how little he understood about what he'd actually done. Richard, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about professional integrity and accurate attribution of innovative work. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to an angry whisper. Be very careful, Sarah. You signed a consulting agreement that gives Morrison Holdings full rights to any work you did on our projects. If you try to claim credit for Emerald Shores, I'll sue you for breach of contract and theft of proprietary information. The threat was exactly what I'd been expecting, and I was prepared for it. That's interesting, Richard. I'd love to review that consulting agreement again. Could you send me a copy? Something in my calm response seemed to unnerve him further. You know what you signed, and you know what the consequences will be if you keep pushing this. Before I could respond, Dr. Harrison approached us with a small group of conference attendees who wanted to meet Richard. As he was drawn back into professional networking, I caught his eye one last time. The fear I saw there told me everything I needed to know about the strength of his legal position. The afternoon sessions proceeded normally, but I noticed that Richard's entourage had thinned considerably. Several of the media representatives who'd arrived with him seemed to have lost interest after his technically deficient presentation. More significantly, the professional conversations I overheard throughout the day included increasing skepticism about his role in developing the innovations he'd claimed. As the day wound down, Janet found me in the parking lot as I was preparing to drive home. Sarah, I've spoken with several colleagues about the irregularities in Richard's awards submission. There's going to be an informal review of the documentation next week. This was exactly the development I'd been hoping for. Once the Environmental Council began investigating the true authorship of the innovations, Richard's fraud would be exposed systematically rather than through personal accusations that could be dismissed as professional jealousy. What do you need from me? I asked. Everything you have that documents your role in developing these technologies. Timeline, research notes, preliminary designs, correspondence, anything that establishes when and how you created these innovations. I assured her that I had comprehensive documentation and would organize it for review. As I drove home through the evening traffic, I reflected on how much had changed in just one day. This morning, Richard had been the celebrated innovator preparing to share his vision with the environmental community. Tonight, he was a suspected fraud whose professional reputation was beginning to crumble under scrutiny from the people who actually understood the work he'd stolen. But I knew this was just the beginning. Richard wouldn't accept the destruction of his reputation passively, and he had resources and connections that I lacked. The consulting agreement he'd threatened me with was a real concern. I needed to review the actual language to understand my legal position. More importantly, I needed to prepare for whatever countermeasures he might take to protect himself and discredit me. The next phase of this confrontation would require careful strategy and potentially some allies I hadn't yet cultivated. Richard had called me a burden at Christmas dinner, but he was about to discover that some burdens become heavier the more you try to carry them, and I was just getting started. Sunday morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Marcus Webb, the environmental lawyer who'd represented several architects in intellectual property disputes. Ms. Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday. I was at yesterday's conference and witnessed Mr. Morrison's presentation. Based on what I observed, I think we need to talk. Marcus had built his reputation defending architects and engineers whose work had been stolen or misattributed by larger firms. His interest in my situation suggested that Richard's fraud was more obvious than I'd realized, and that legal remedies might be available. We arranged to meet Monday morning, and I spent Sunday organizing my documentation and preparing for what might become a protracted legal battle. Richard had made the mistake of stealing from someone who understood both the technical and business sides of architecture. He was about to learn that being underestimated can be a significant strategic advantage. As I worked through my files, preparing evidence of my innovations and Richard's theft, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine optimism about the future. The burden he'd tried to place on me was about to become his own crushing weight, and I intended to make sure he carried it for a very long time. Marcus Webb's law office occupied the top floor of a renovated brick building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the city's architectural landscape. As I sat across from his mahogany desk Monday morning, surrounded by legal volumes and framed certificates documenting his victories in intellectual property cases, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Richard's theft had been revealed. Marcus reviewed my documentation with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades untangling complex ownership disputes. He examined my original sketches, cross-referenced email timestamps, and studied the technical specifications, with an attention to detail that reminded me why he'd earned his reputation as the most effective IP attorney in the region. Ms. Chen, what you've presented here constitutes one of the clearest cases of intellectual property theft I've encountered, he said after nearly an hour of review. The timeline alone establishes beyond doubt that these innovations originated from your independent research predating any involvement with Morrison Holdings. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by apprehension about what legal action might entail. What are our options? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. We have several avenues: copyright infringement for the stolen designs, fraud regarding the award submission, and potentially breach of fiduciary duty if we can establish that Morrison Holdings had an obligation to accurately represent your contributions. He paused, studying my face. But before we discuss litigation strategy, I need to address something that might complicate our case. You mentioned that Morrison threatened you with a consulting agreement that allegedly gives his company rights to your work. Have you reviewed that document recently? The question I'd been dreading. Not since I signed it 18 months ago. At the time, Richard presented it as a standard consulting arrangement. I'll need to see that agreement immediately. Depending on its language, it could limit our options or provide additional evidence of Morrison's fraudulent intent. I promised to locate the contract and provide it by end of business, though a growing knot in my stomach suggested that Richard's confidence about his legal position might not have been entirely bluster. Still, Marcus's expertise and evident enthusiasm for the case gave me hope that legal remedies were possible. The real breakthrough came Tuesday afternoon when Janet called with news that accelerated everything. Sarah, the Environmental Council's review committee, met this morning. They've found sufficient irregularities in Morrison's award submission to warrant a formal investigation. My pulse quickened. What does that mean practically? It means Morrison Holdings will be required to provide detailed documentation about the development process for all innovations claimed in their submission. If they can't demonstrate legitimate authorship, the award will be revoked, and Morrison could face sanctions for fraudulent submission. This was exactly the external validation I'd needed. The Environmental Council's investigation would establish official recognition that Richard's claims were fraudulent, providing the foundation for broader legal action and professional consequences. But Janet's next revelation was even more significant. Sarah, there's something else. 3 other architects have come forward claiming that Morrison Holdings has misrepresented their contributions to various projects over the past 2 years. You're not the only victim. The scope of Richard's fraud was apparently much broader than I'd realized. If multiple architects had been systematically cheated by Morrison Holdings, it suggested a pattern of behavior that would be much harder for Richard to explain away as misunderstandings or contractual disputes. Would these other architects be willing to coordinate their efforts? I asked. I think so. They're as frustrated as you are, and they recognize that individual complaints might be dismissed while coordinated action would be harder to ignore. The possibility of joining forces with other victims transformed my understanding of the situation. Instead of appearing as a single disgruntled consultant pursuing personal grievances, I could be part of a group of professionals seeking justice for systematic fraud. The difference in credibility and media appeal would be substantial. Wednesday. Morning brought the contract review I'd been anticipating with dread. Marcus called me into his office with an expression that was difficult to read, and I braced myself for bad news about the legal constraints I'd unknowingly accepted. Ms. Chen, I've reviewed your consulting agreement with Morrison Holdings, and there are several interesting aspects we need to discuss. He spread the contract across his desk, pointing to specific clauses highlighted in yellow. The intellectual property assignment language is indeed broad, giving Morrison Holdings rights to work product created during the consulting engagement. However, there are two critical problems with their position. My apprehension began to ease as he continued. First, the agreement specifically defines work product as architectural services and deliverables created pursuant to the scope of work outlined in Exhibit A. The problem is that Exhibit A describes only basic design services, not the innovative technologies that became the core of the Emerald Shores project. This was better news than I'd dared to hope for. So my innovations fall outside the scope of what I contracted to provide. Exactly. But more importantly, the agreement contains language requiring Morrison Holdings to accurately represent the contributions of consulting professionals in all public communications and professional submissions. By claiming exclusive credit for your innovations, Morrison has breached their own contract. Marcus's analysis revealed that Richard's legal position was far weaker than his threats had suggested. Not only had he stolen work that wasn't covered by our agreement, but he'd violated the contract's requirements for accurate attribution. His intimidation tactics had been based on the assumption that I wouldn't carefully review the legal documents or seek qualified representation. What's our next step? I asked. We file a comprehensive lawsuit alleging intellectual property theft, breach of contract, fraud, and defamation. But more strategically, we coordinate with the other affected architects to present a united front that demonstrates Morrison's pattern of fraudulent behavior. The coordination meeting took place Thursday evening in Janet's conference room, bringing together 4 architects who'd been victimized by Richard's systematic theft. Each had a similar story: initial partnership promises, gradual marginalization, and ultimate theft of their innovative work. Together, we represented over 60 years of architectural experience and innovations worth millions in economic value. Patricia Gonzalez, a landscape architect specializing in urban water management, had developed revolutionary stormwater systems that Richard was marketing as Morrison Holdings innovations. David Kim, an expert in passive energy design, had created building orientation and ventilation technologies that were now attributed to Richard's engineering team. Maria Santos, who specialized in sustainable materials, had developed new approaches to locally sourced construction that were being presented as Morrison Holdings' proprietary methods. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. Richard had systematically identified talented architects facing financial pressures, hired them as consultants, stolen their innovations, and then marginalized them while claiming credit for their work. It was a business model built on intellectual property theft, disguised as collaborative development. We need to coordinate our response carefully, Marcus advised as we reviewed each case. Individual lawsuits might be seen as professional disputes, but a coordinated action alleging systematic fraud will be much harder to dismiss or defend against. Patricia, who'd been dealing with Richard's theft the longest, raised a crucial point. What about the media strategy? Morrison has built his reputation through careful public relations. We need to control the narrative, or he'll spin this as disgruntled consultants seeking undeserved credit. This was where my environmental conference strategy proved valuable. The professional community was already questioning Richard's technical knowledge based on his inadequate presentation. Adding systematic fraud allegations from multiple respected architects would complete the destruction of his credibility. We agreed to file coordinated lawsuits on Monday morning, accompanied by a joint press release detailing Richard's pattern of intellectual property theft. Janet would simultaneously present our coordinated evidence to the Environmental Council's investigation, while Marcus would notify relevant professional organizations about potential ethical violations. Friday brought an unexpected development that accelerated our timeline dramatically. Emma called me at home that evening, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth," she began without her usual pleasantries. "Of course. What's wrong?" Richard has been acting strangely since his conference presentation. He's been working late every night, making phone calls he won't discuss. And yesterday I overheard him talking to his lawyer about damage control and liability exposure. My sister's loyalty to her husband was finally showing cracks under the weight of his suspicious behavior. "Emma, what exactly did you hear?" "He was talking about consulting agreements and intellectual property disputes. Sarah, he mentioned your name specifically, along with 3 other people I didn't recognize. He said something about containing the situation before it spreads." Emma's revelation confirmed that Richard was aware of our coordinated effort and was taking steps to defend himself. More importantly, it suggested that my sister was beginning to question the narrative he'd constructed about our professional relationship. "Emma, I need to tell you something about the Emerald Shores project and my actual role in its development." Over the next hour, I walked my sister through the complete timeline of my innovations, the documentation proving my authorship, and Richard's systematic theft of credit. I explained about the other architects he'd victimized and the coordinated legal action we were preparing. Most difficult, I had to help her understand that the husband she'd defended was not the innovative visionary she'd believed, but a fraud who'd built his reputation on stolen work. Emma's response was devastating in its quiet intensity. "Sarah, I found something in Richard's home office last week that I didn't understand at the time. There's a file cabinet with folders labeled with names, including yours. Each folder contains architectural drawings and technical documents. The implications were staggering. Richard hadn't just stolen our work. He'd been systematically collecting and organizing our innovations like trophies. Emma, would you be willing to document what you found?" "I already did. I photographed everything Sunday night when Richard was out of town. I didn't know why at the time, but something felt wrong about him keeping other people's work in his private files. My sister's evidence would provide the final piece of our case against Richard. Her photographs would demonstrate that he'd been deliberately collecting stolen intellectual property, making it impossible for him to claim that misattribution had been accidental or the result of administrative oversight. Sarah, there's something else. Richard received a call yesterday that left him visibly shaken. After he hung up, he told me he might need to travel for business unexpectedly. I think he's planning to leave town before your legal action becomes public. The possibility that Richard might flee before facing consequences added urgency to our timeline. Marcus agreed to file our lawsuits first thing Saturday morning, accompanied by requests for immediate injunctive relief to prevent destruction of evidence and flight from jurisdiction. Saturday morning, I stood in the lobby of the courthouse, with 3 other architects, watching Marcus file the legal documents that would formally expose Richard's fraud and begin the process of reclaiming our stolen work. The coordinated lawsuits alleging intellectual property theft, fraud, and racketeering represented the culmination of months of careful planning and documentation. The press release went out simultaneously, detailing Richard's systematic theft. From multiple architects and the evidence supporting our claims, within hours, local media outlets were covering the story, and professional publications were requesting interviews with the affected architects. Richard's response was swift and predictable. His attorney issued a statement dismissing our allegations as desperate attempts by unsuccessful consultants to claim credit for innovations they lack the vision and expertise to develop. He characterized our coordinated action as a conspiracy to damage his reputation and steal proprietary information belonging to Morrison Holdings. But Richard's damage control efforts were undermined by his technical deficiencies at the environmental conference. Several attendees had already shared their concerns about his presentation with industry publications, and our fraud allegations provided context that explained his obvious lack of understanding about the innovations he'd claimed. The Environmental Council's investigation concluded Monday afternoon with a finding that Morrison Holdings had submitted fraudulent information in their award application. The Green Innovation Award was formally revoked, and Richard was banned from future submissions pending a comprehensive review of all projects attributed to his company. Tuesday brought the media interview that transformed our professional dispute into a broader story about innovation, recognition, and accountability in male-dominated industries. The segment aired during prime time, featuring all 4 architects, explaining how our work had been stolen and repackaged as Richard's innovations. The interview focused particularly on the systematic nature of Richard's fraud and the millions of dollars in economic value represented by our stolen innovations. When asked about our motivation for coming forward, Patricia articulated what we'd all been feeling. This isn't about personal recognition or professional jealousy. This is about protecting the integrity of innovation and ensuring that the people who actually create breakthrough technologies receive appropriate credit. Richard's attempt to respond only made his situation worse. His lawyer arranged a follow-up interview intended to present his side of the story, but Richard's inability to explain technical details about the innovations he'd claimed exposed his fraud even more clearly. When asked specific questions about the development process for technologies attributed to his company, his responses were vague and technically inaccurate. The interview became a case study in how intellectual property thieves reveal themselves. When forced to discuss work they don't actually understand. Richard's obvious discomfort with technical questions and his reliance on general business terminology instead of specific architectural knowledge made it clear that he was not the innovator he'd pretended to be. By Wednesday, the story had gained national attention, with environmental and architectural publications covering the scandal as an example of broader problems in the construction industry. Professional organizations began reviewing their policies for preventing and addressing intellectual property theft, using our case as a cautionary tale about the importance of accurate attribution. The real vindication came Thursday morning when I received a call from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the new director of the National Sustainable Architecture Initiative. Ms. Chen, we've been following the coverage of your situation with Morrison Holdings, and we'd like to discuss an opportunity that might interest you. The initiative was offering me a position as their Chief Innovation Officer, with responsibility for developing new standards for environmental technology and ensuring proper attribution of breakthrough developments. It was exactly the kind of recognition and platform I'd been seeking throughout my career. We're particularly interested in your living building concept, Dr. Martinez continued. The Technical Review Committee believes it represents the most significant advance in sustainable architecture in the past decade. We'd like to support further development and implementation of your innovations. The position offered not just professional validation, but the resources to continue developing the technologies that Richard had tried to claim. More importantly, it provided a platform for mentoring other architects and ensuring that the next generation of innovators would be protected from the kind of theft I'd experienced. Friday brought the news I'd been hoping for since the legal action began. Marcus called with an update on Morrison Holdings' response to our lawsuits. Sarah, Richard's company has filed for bankruptcy protection, and their insurance carrier is seeking settlement negotiations for all outstanding claims. The bankruptcy filing revealed the extent to which Richard's business model had depended on stolen intellectual property. Without the innovations he'd claimed, Morrison Holdings had no legitimate technological assets and no sustainable competitive advantage. The company's collapse validated our argument that Richard had been a fraud rather than an innovator. "What does the settlement offer look like?" I asked. "Full attribution of all innovations to their actual creators, financial compensation based on the economic value of your technologies, and agreement that Morrison Holdings will publicly acknowledge the theft and misattribution." The settlement terms exceeded what I'd hoped to achieve through litigation. Beyond the financial compensation, the public acknowledgement would restore our professional reputations and provide a cautionary example for other potential intellectual property thieves. But the most satisfying aspect of Richard's downfall came from an unexpected source. Emma called me Saturday evening with a final update on her husband's situation. "Sarah, Richard's been served with papers for 3 additional lawsuits from architects in other states. Apparently, his theft wasn't limited to local professionals. The FBI is also investigating potential wire fraud charges related to his award, submissions, and investor presentations." The federal investigation transformed Richard's situation from a civil dispute to potential criminal liability. His systematic fraud had crossed state lines and involved federal agencies, making this a case that could result in significant prison time rather than just financial penalties. "Emma, how are you handling all of this?" "Honestly, I'm relieved. Living with someone whose success was built on lies was more stressful than I realized. I've filed for divorce, and I'm moving back to our parents' house temporarily." My sister's decision to leave Richard represented the final collapse of the persona he'd constructed. Without his stolen innovations, his company, or his family support, he was left with nothing but the legal consequences of his fraud. The resolution came more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Facing potential federal charges and with his company in bankruptcy, Richard agreed to a comprehensive settlement that acknowledged his theft and provided full compensation to all affected architects. He also accepted a permanent ban from the architecture and development industries, ensuring that he couldn't victimize other professionals in the future. The settlement hearing took place the following Tuesday, bringing together all the architects Richard had victimized along with representatives from the professional organizations that had been monitoring our case. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the judge formally approve the settlement terms, I reflected on how completely the situation had been reversed since that Christmas dinner 6 months earlier. Richard had called me a burden, suggesting that my age and experience made me irrelevant in an industry that valued youth and innovation. But the resolution of our case had demonstrated exactly the opposite. That experience provided the knowledge and networks necessary to expose fraud and protect professional integrity. The press conference following the settlement focused on the broader implications of our case for the architecture industry. All 4 affected architects spoke about the importance of proper attribution and the dangers of allowing systematic, intellectual property theft to go unchallenged. When asked about my next steps, I announced my acceptance of the National Sustainable Architecture Initiative position and outlined my plans for developing new protections for architectural innovations. This case has shown that individual architects are vulnerable to theft by larger organizations, but it's also demonstrated that coordinated action can expose fraud and protect our profession's integrity. The final vindication came 3 months later at the Rebuilt Environmental Council Conference, where I was invited to present the keynote address on sustainable innovation and professional ethics. Standing at the same podium where Richard had exposed his fraud, I shared the real story of the living building concept and its development. The audience included many of the same professionals who had witnessed Richard's technical incompetence 6 months earlier. Their enthusiastic response to my presentation, particularly the detailed technical questions that I could answer comprehensively, provided a stark contrast to Richard's obvious lack of understanding. After the presentation, Dr. Harrison approached me with congratulations and an observation that perfectly captured the transformation. Sarah, the difference between authentic innovation and stolen ideas has never been more clear. Your technical mastery and genuine understanding of these concepts is obvious to everyone in this room. As I drove home from the conference, I passed the construction site where Richard's Emerald Shores Resort was finally nearing completion. The signs now correctly identified GreenSpace Designs as the architect and listed my name prominently as the designer of the living building systems. The recognition I'd fought for was now permanently established, ensuring that future generations would understand the true authorship of these innovations. The final irony came the following week when I received a letter from Richard himself. Written from the minimum security federal facility where he was serving his sentence for wire fraud. The letter was brief and surprisingly honest about what had happened. Sarah, I know my apology means nothing after what I did to you and the others, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. I convinced myself that I was a visionary who deserved credit for recognizing the value of your innovations. But the truth is, I was just a thief who got caught. You were never a burden. You were the most talented architect I ever worked with, and I destroyed both our careers because I was too insecure to acknowledge that. I read the letter once and then filed it away without responding. Richard's belated recognition of my abilities and his crimes didn't change what had happened, but it provided closure to a chapter of my life that had been defined by his theft and my fight for justice. The real transformation was visible in my new office at the National Sustainable Architecture Initiative, where my team of 12 architects was developing the next generation of environmental technologies. The walls displayed the patents and awards that properly credited my innovations. But more importantly, they were covered with drawings and models created by young architects whose work would never be stolen because of the protections we were implementing. My assistant knocked on the door as I was reviewing proposals for our latest research initiative. Ms. Chen, there's a reporter here from Architecture Today. They're doing a feature on the anniversary of the Morrison Holdings case and its impact on intellectual property protection in the industry. The interview covered familiar ground about the theft, the investigation, and the eventual resolution, but the reporter's final question addressed the broader significance of what had happened. Ms. Chen, what advice would you give to other architects who might be facing similar situations? I considered the question carefully before responding. Document everything, trust your expertise, and remember that authentic innovation always reveals itself under scrutiny. People who steal ideas can never defend them as effectively as the people who actually created them. As the reporter packed up her equipment, I returned to reviewing the research proposals that would shape the next phase of my career. Richard had tried to make me a burden, an aging architect whose time had passed. Instead, he'd created the conditions for my greatest professional triumph and ensured that my innovations would be properly protected and attributed for generations to come. The framed photograph on my desk showed all 4 victimized architects at the settlement hearing, standing together as colleagues who had refused to let theft define our careers. We'd proven that experience and expertise could overcome fraud, and that coordinated action could expose even systematic deception. 6 months after Richard called me a burden during Christmas dinner, I'd become the Chief Innovation Officer for the nation's premier sustainable architecture initiative, with my technologies being implemented in projects across the country. The burden he'd tried to place on me had become the weight that crushed his fraudulent career and exposed the truth about who the real innovators were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.